if you look at the bottom of a really formal business email.
Oh, yeah, especially in certain corporate cultures.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You'll often see this sign-off, something like, we pray for your continued health and prosperity.
Right, which is, I mean, it's polite, it's expected.
Totally expected.
Yeah.
Honestly, it has become the emotional equivalent of clicking, I agree to the terms and conditions when you download a new app.
That is a great comparison.
They just scroll to the bottom, tap the button, and you don't really process the weight of what you just agreed to at all.
It just becomes a reflex.
Yeah.
And that reflex kind of bleeds into how we process tragedies on social media, too.
Oh, for sure.
Like the immediate, almost robotic response is, sending thoughts and prayers.
Right.
There's rarely a specific intention behind the words anymore. It's really just a linguistic placeholder that essentially means, I'm acknowledging your situation, and I hope things eventually work out.
Yeah, but when you stop and actually examine a word like prayer or its companion worship, you realize we've taken these massive earth-shaking concepts and, well, shrunk them down into vague, harmless formalities.
We really have.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled you're here with us because today our mission is to completely dismantle and reconstruct your understanding of what prayer and worship actually mean.
It's going to be a good one.
It really is.
Yeah.
And to do that, we are stepping into some deeply fascinating source material today.
We are. We're looking at a message delivered on August 31st, 2025 by Pastor Yasushi Nemoto at Kahului Union Church in Maui.
In Maui, yeah.
Yeah. It's part 3 of a 5-part series called Understanding the Church, and this specific message is titled The Place Where We Worship God.
And Pastor Nemoto's starting point is incredibly compelling because he addresses that exact cultural reflex we were just talking about.
Right.
He points out how in Japanese culture, the word prayer is everywhere, like praying for success in exams or praying for business prosperity.
Praying for the departed, yeah.
Exactly. It's a cultural staple, but it is almost entirely empty of its original gravity. It's just an expression of a vague hope without a specific object.
Without any real direction.
Right. And he asks this brilliant, grounding question. He asks, have you ever actually seen someone truly praying when they casually say those words?
And, I mean, the answer is almost always no.
No, never.
Because the biblical framework for prayer is not about tossing a vague wish into the universe and hoping the cosmos sorts it out.
Right.
The Bible defines prayer as an active state of worshiping God. It has a direction. It has an object.
Yeah, it's targeted.
Exactly. And our deep dive today is going to pull 3 core truths from this message about what and where true worship actually is.
Because if our fundamental definition of the act is wrong, our understanding of where it should happen is going to be wildly distorted.
Oh, completely.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
To understand the where, we first have to fundamentally redefine the what. And Pastor Nemoto anchors this first paradigm shift in the book of Romans.
Romans 11.36 specifically. That specific verse is a massive pivot point in the text, and the context around it explains why.
Because it's a huge buildup, right?
Oh, massive.
Mm-hmm.
For 3 entire chapters leading up to that moment, Romans 9, 10, and 11, the Apostle Paul is wrestling with one of the most complex, agonizing theological arguments in the entire biblical text.
Yeah.
He's dealing with the concept of predestination, the sovereign choices of God, and, the heartbreak of Israel's rejection of the Messiah.
It's heavy stuff.
Very heavy. He is trying to map out the unmappable logic of divine mercy.
He's pushing the absolute limits of human intellect there. He's building this towering academic argument, but then he hits a wall.
He really does.
He gets to the very end of chapter 11, and instead of wrapping it up with a neat intellectual summary, his mind just gives way.
Yeah.
He shifts completely from theology to doxology.
Right, he just bursts into praise.
Yeah. He writes, for from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen.
And that shift right there is the mechanism of worship.
Wow. Okay.
Paul acknowledges that human comprehension has a limit, and where comprehension ends, surrender begins.
That's powerful.
He's stating that everything begins with God, is sustained by God, and ultimately returns to God. And this gives us Pastor Nemoto's first core truth.
Which is?
Worship is not something we consume. It is something we offer to God. It is the conscious act of returning everything to him.
Okay, let me pause you right there, because I really want to look at how this idea of an offering collides with our modern psychology.
Yeah, that's a huge point of friction.
Because Pastor Nemoto brings up the reality of modern megachurches. or giga churches.
Right.
And if I walk into a room with $1 million sound system, intelligent lighting sweeping over a crowd of thousands, and a meticulously rehearsed band, my brain is biologically wired to consume that as entertainment.
Like going to a concert.
Exactly like buying a ticket to a concert.
Yeah.
I'm going to sit back in the dark, critique the bass player, and ask, what kind of sermon is the speaker going to give me today to improve my life?
You're describing a consumer experience, which is basically the default setting of modern society.
Right. So my question is, does the sheer scale of those environments, the multisensory production, inherently destroy the capability to offer true biblical worship? Like, are we just physically fighting the consumer wiring in our brains when we enter a room designed to entertain us?
What's fascinating here is how Pastor Nemoto navigates that exact tension.
Okay.
He explicitly states that the problem is not the architecture. It's not the scale or the production value.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the giga church has a purpose. Just as the small, quiet, traditional church with wooden pews has a purpose.
Interesting.
The barrier to worship is not external, it's internal. The barrier is the expectation of receiving.
Oh, okay, that actually makes perfect sense. Because you can have a consumer mindset in a tiny room, too.
Exactly.
You might sit in a church of 20 people, listen to an out-of-tune piano, and think, I'm so bored, I'm not getting anything out of this.
Precisely. Both the person mesmerized by the lasers and the person complaining about the out-of-tune piano are suffering from the exact same psychological distortion.
Which is what?
They both believe they are the audience.
Wow.
And this is the major shift the text demands. We are not the audience. God is the audience.
That reframes the entire gathering.
It really does.
It means the gathering, whether it's 10,000 people in a stadium or just a handful of people in a living room, is an act of returning to God what he is worthy of. We are the performers, in a spiritual sense, offering our attention and reverence to the only audience member who actually matters.
And that psychological reframing immediately forces us to reconsider the physical space.
Right.
Because if worship is an offering we make rather than a performance we attend, the historical obsession with finding the correct location suddenly seems misplaced.
Which brings us to one of the most famous and, frankly, most intense geographical disputes in the entire biblical narrative.
John chapter 4.
Yes. John chapter 4. The encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. And to really grasp what is happening here, we have to look at the history of the turf war she brings up.
It's so much deeper than a simple theological disagreement.
It really is.
This was a blood feud.
It was a literal blood feud. You have the Jewish people insisting that the temple in Jerusalem is the absolute, unquestionable epicenter of true worship.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Samaritans had built their own rival temple on Mount Gerizim. And historically, it wasn't just a peaceful disagreement. Back in the 2nd century BC, a Jewish leader actually marched his army to Mount Gerizim and destroyed the Samaritan temple.
Just leveled it.
Yeah. So when this woman brings up the debate over whether worship belongs on this mountain or in Jerusalem, she isn't just asking a polite religious question. She is invoking centuries of generational trauma and hatred.
She's testing him.
She is asking Jesus to take a side in a war.
And Jesus completely bypasses the political trap.
It does.
He doesn't validate Jerusalem, and he doesn't validate Gerizim. He tells her that an hour is coming and has now arrived when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth.
Yeah.
He says God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. In one sentence, he entirely divorces the act of worship from a specific zip code.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. The mechanism of how he explains this. Because before they even get to the political debate about the mountains, Jesus introduces this concept of living water.
Right, the well.
Yeah, this woman has been locked in a brutal daily cycle.
Yeah.
She comes to this physical well in the heat of the day, draws physical water, drinks it, and then inevitably gets thirsty again.
It's a profound metaphor for relying on external religious systems.
Yes. I was trying to think of a modern way to visualize this. It's like setting up an incredibly elaborate, expensive rain catchment system in the middle of a desert.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
You can build it perfectly,
Yeah.
right? But you are entirely dependent on the external condition of a storm rolling in. If it doesn't rain, your system is useless and you stay thirsty.
You're at the mercy of the environment.
Exactly. Or like painting a house with a crumbling foundation. It looks great on the outside, but it's just an external fabrication. What Jesus is offering with the living water is entirely different.
It's internal.
Right. It's like having an artesian well drilled straight into the bedrock beneath your house. An artesian well doesn't need a pump, and it doesn't need rain. The internal pressure of the aquifer naturally forces the water to the surface continuously.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize the theology of John 4.
It just clicks.
It does.
Yeah.
Jesus is targeting the external fabrication. When he offers her living water that becomes a spring welling up to eternal life, he is describing an internal transformation.
Yeah.
When a person receives that living water, true worship naturally overflows from the inside out, driven by its own internal pressure.
It isn't something you have to manufacture with the right lighting, the right historic architecture, or the right mountain.
Exactly. And Pastor Nemoto applies this directly to his own congregation in Maui.
Okay, how so?
He reminds them that their church building might be small or unassuming, but if the people sitting in those chairs have received that living water, if their minds are renewed and their hearts are turned toward God in obedience, then that small room becomes a profoundly true place of worship.
Wow.
The location is validated by the internal state of the people, not the other way around.
So what does this all mean when we leave the building?
That's the real question.
Because if true worship is this internal artesian well rather than a location-based rain catcher, then limiting it to a Sunday morning gathering makes absolutely no sense. If the aquifer is inside you, it goes with you on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
It demands a total, comprehensive lifestyle shift,
Right.
which is the third core truth Pastor Nemoto pulls from the text.
Right.
Anchored in Romans 12:1-2, Paul writes, "Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship."
I need to push back on this, or at least admit some real confusion here, because
Sure, go ahead.
the phrase living sacrifice sounds incredibly profound until you try to actually apply it to the daily grind.
It can feel very abstract.
Right. I struggle to see how answering a boring, passive-aggressive corporate email can actually be an act of worship. Or like, is folding my kids' laundry really a living sacrifice? Sometimes it feels like we're just watering down the word holy and slapping spiritual labels on the mundane aspects of, just normal life, just to make ourselves feel better about being exhausted.
That is a very valid critique of how this verse is often misused.
Really?
Oh, yeah. If we just casually label everything worship without changing our internal posture, then yes, we're just watering down the word.
Okay.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture that Pastor Nemoto is painting, Paul is describing a very specific cognitive and spiritual mechanism.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, he follows up living sacrifice by saying, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. The laundry doesn't magically become worship just because you're a believer.
Right.
It becomes worship because of how your mind is operating while you fold it.
Oh, I see. What does that cognitive shift actually look like in practice?
Pastor Nemoto contrasts this beautifully with the tradition of visiting a Japanese shrine.
Okay, the cultural context again.
Right. When people go to a shrine, the interaction is largely transactional and external.
Just going through the motions.
Exactly. You go to the specific location, you ring the bell or clap your hands, you make a polite request for good fortune, and you walk away.
Yeah.
There is zero expectation that the visit is going to fundamentally alter your psychology or your character. You check the box.
Right. It's an external form, a ritual.
But Romans 12 is demanding internal transformation. The source material lists out the old ways of thinking that we have to be freed from.
What are the old ways?
The old ways are living with ourselves as the ultimate standard, doing things only if they provide personal benefit,
Well, what?
making decisions based entirely on the fear of man or how other people perceive us, chasing worldly metrics like success, reputation, and money.
I mean, that is essentially the default operating system of the human brain. We are totally wired for self-preservation and social status.
Exactly. So to answer your question about the corporate email, if you respond to that passive-aggressive email out of defensiveness, ego, or the fear of looking bad to your boss, you are operating in the old ways.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It is not worship. But if you pause, recognize that defensive instinct, actively surrender it, and choose to respond with unnatural grace, integrity, and a desire to honor God in your work ethic, that cognitive pivot is the renewal of the mind.
Wow.
That choice is the living sacrifice.
The sacrifice isn't the email itself. The sacrifice is the surrender of my ego in the moment I hit send.
That is the mechanism. True worship happens on a Tuesday afternoon at your desk. It happens in the kitchen when you are navigating a deeply frustrating conversation with your spouse and you choose patience over being right.
That was convicting.
Right. Wherever a human heart actively wrestles its default selfishness into submission and turns toward God, right there in that very spot, God-pleasing worship is born. It completely obliterates the idea that worship is confined to a religious building.
That gives so much weight to the moments of life we usually try to rush through.
It really does.
It means there are no throwaway moments. And that expansive view brings us to this incredible conclusion Pastor Nemoto draws, which serves as kind of the great unifier of everything we've talked about today.
This is a beautiful way to tie it all together.
He looks at the two biblical figures we've anchored this entire discussion on, the Samaritan woman and the Apostle Paul.
And the psychological contrast between these two is staggering.
It really is. Because you, the listener tuning into this deep dive, you likely know their basic biographies.
Right.
We know the Samaritan woman was a social outcast, living on the margins, likely in an immoral relationship, trying to avoid the judgment of her community.
Right.
And we know Paul was the ultimate religious insider, a Pharisee of Pharisees, highly educated, universally respected.
A little opposite socially.
Exactly. But if we strip away the societal labels and just look at their psychology before they met Jesus, we see something entirely different.
We see two human beings running on completely dry wells.
Yes, they were both deeply, profoundly exhausted.
Neither of them knew what true worship was. The Samaritan woman was relying on her cultural traditions and her own grueling survival instincts just to make it through the week.
Yeah.
Paul was relying on his intense, white-knuckled religious willpower and his flawless outward morality.
Just exhausted.
One was exhausted by shame and the other was exhausted by perfectionism, but the internal result was the exact same.
But then the encounter happens, and the aftermath of their encounters with Jesus isn't just a change in theological perspective.
No, not at all.
It's an explosive behavioral transformation.
Yeah.
The Samaritan woman drops her water jar, the actual physical object of her daily survival, and runs back toward the very people who shunned her, declaring, "I have met him."
She completely abandons her fear of man.
And Paul, the religious elite, completely abandons his status and his perfect resume, declaring, "I have been captured by Christ," devoting his entire life to him.
Despite their wildly different coping mechanisms, they both received renewed hearts. They stopped relying on external forms and began to live from that internal artesian well of living water.
It's amazing.
And that is the ultimate proof that biblical worship is not a one-hour Sunday event. It's an encounter that fundamentally alters the trajectory and the daily mechanics of your entire life.
So to you, the listener, the application embedded in this message from Maui is incredibly direct.
It is.
If you are examining your own faith today and you realize it has become merely an outward routine, if you find yourself just blindly clicking, "I agree" to the terms and conditions on your spiritual life without any internal transformation, the invitation here is to stop relying on the form.
Stop trying to catch rain in the desert.
Exactly. Pastor Nemoto suggests believing that Jesus can give you a new heart and making this simple internal confession, "Lord, I will live for you." Because it's from that exact posture of offering that the mind is renewed and a completely new walk begins.
This raises an important question, though, one that pushes this concept into the most difficult corners of our lives.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we've established that biblical worship is an ongoing, living sacrifice and that it includes the mundane choices of a Tuesday afternoon.
Right.
But if our entire life is an offering, how does that reframe our moments of utter failure? When you hit a point of deep burnout, when your patience fails, when you completely drop the ball at work or at home, what does it look like to offer that brokenness to God as a living sacrifice, trusting that He is an audience who accepts the shattered pieces just as much as the victories?
Wow. Does the internal well of worship still flow when we feel completely empty? It fundamentally changes how we view our own weaknesses. Something to deeply consider as you go about your week. What does the worship of your most unremarkable weekday look like when absolutely no one is in the audience but God?
It's a profound thought.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.